Let me take you back to 2018. I was writing a history of the launch and early life of the Commodore Amiga, and during my research, I was seeking sales figures. You'd think it would be a simple case of Googling it. But if you start to dig into the sources, the figures you find are tenuous at best. Some are estimates, others from unsourced quotes, and many are just plain wrong. I arrived at a horrible conclusion. Nobody knows how many Amigas Commodore sold. There are some numbers out there. The most prominent claim is that shown on Wikipedia. The Amiga page lists 4.85 million units sold. The cited article reveals the ultimate source. The figure comes from a 1993 issue of Amiga Format. The magazine article is centered on the World of Commodore show in New York, which took place in April '93. It's here that Amiga Format would have had the chance to talk to Commodore employees and obtain sales information. But the magazine contradicts itself. On one page they claim 4.5 million Amigas sold, but the regional figures add up to the 4.85 million figure instead. It's clear there's been some rounding up, coupled with optimistic exaggeration. So the 4.85 million figure is based on some fairly spurious data from a mid-1993 magazine. Surely we could do better. Another figure is one that claims to come from a reputable source at Commodore. According to Dr. Peter Kittel, an employee of Commodore Germany, the Amiga sold 5,292,000 up to the end of 1993. Kittel was from Commodore, so he must have known his stuff, right? And the breakdown of model sales in Germany seems pretty authentic. So I looked for a copy of the original source, the email from Dr. Kittel, to verify the claim. And with some help from archive.org, I was able to find the original email. But the 5.292 million isn't listed. It's conspicuously absent. Was it from another email? Was it trimmed from quoted text? Well, it took some Googling. The trick was to replace the numbers' comma separators with full stops to find the original German source, but I found it. 5.292 million is not how many Amigas were sold worldwide. It's the total number of Commodore machines sold in Germany. This figure includes 1.6 million Amigas, but also extends to the Commodore 64 as well. The sales figures floating around on the internet don't hold up to much scrutiny. It would be nice to have an official source. Unfortunately, Commodore were not exactly forthcoming with their sales figures. Sometimes we'd get hints in interviews, but never anything concrete. But as a public company, they were obligated to release annual shareholder reports, an audited insight into the company's finances. These could provide the necessary data to piece together a comprehensive sales history. I saw them cited a couple of times and sought copies of these potentially useful documents, but my search was to no avail. I suspect very few copies exist today. In a final act of desperation, I turned to eBay in the hope that someone, somewhere, had decided to list theirs. Of course they hadn't. All I could do was set up a search alert for Commodore Annual Report. I didn't dare to dream that it would ever pay off. But a year or so later, I received an email. Someone had listed not one, but 4 consecutive reports from 1990 to 1993, the final 4 years before Commodore's bankruptcy. I jumped at the chance to buy them, but once they arrived, I realized my video was already published, and their only use now was to gather dust on a shelf. But in the back of my mind, something has been gnawing at me. There are secrets in there. Nobody knows how many Amigas were sold, and we could rectify that. So, what do these shareholder reports contain exactly? Each is a staple-bound 20 to 30 page document. It opens with an executive summary containing digested financial performance. A letter to the shareholders from the CEO follows, a reassuring message with promises of future performance. Then, a few pages on the company's products, glossy print detailing last year's success, and an optimistic outlook for the next. The latter half comprises the financial report, with a large amount of hard data, balance sheets and statements, historical comparisons, and breakdowns by quarter. The report closes with a statement from the auditor and a list of corporate information. So, there's a lot of data in there, but sadly unit sales aren't reported in any consistent way. What we do have are accurate revenue figures between 1986 and 1993. This includes Commodore's other products, but we can account for this. The reports also reveal the proportion of their sales derived from the Amiga. So with a little bit of multiplication, we can extract what we need. Unfortunately, the revenue figure includes peripheral sales as well as computers. We can't rely on a consistent attachment rate, nor will sales revenue per unit be constant. So this data gives us an accurate representation of the scale of Amiga sales, but not units. To find accurate unit sales, we're going to need more information. Luckily, there are some clues within the reports that might help us build a complete picture. For instance, the 1992 report reveals that slightly more than 1 million Amigas sold that year. This took the total install base to 3.7 million by the end of the fiscal year. The 91 report states that the 2 million milestone passed in the second quarter. This was a little over a year since the 1 million mark was passed. Another consistent report is the percentage change in Amiga unit sales. There was an increase of 19% in 1989, 26% in 90, 38% in 91, and 17% in 92. From these, we can extrapolate actual unit sales. If 1 million Amigas represented an increase of 17% in 92, we can infer that at least 850,000 Amigas sold in fiscal 91. In turn, that was a 38% increase, which means that at least 610,000 Amigas were sold in fiscal 90. Likewise, 480,000 Amigas in fiscal 89. This gives us at least 2.94 million Amigas sold between July 89 and June 92. By the latter point, lifetime sales were at the 3.7 million mark. This means that fiscal 86, 87 and 88 combined account for somewhere under 760,000 Amigas. This aligns with a press release from Commodore celebrating 600,000 sales in May 1988. So what we have here is a logic puzzle. We have milestones, relative growth between years, and some established figures. We can assume that the percentage growth is rounded to the nearest whole number. So we have a little wiggle room to try and make these numbers work. But does it work? To my surprise, yes. It's possible to satisfy both the growth figures and the milestones. I wouldn't uphold these numbers as true figures, as they're based on approximation, but they do line up with all the information we have. So we've obtained a fairly clear picture of Amiga sales using the reports. But there's a problem. The final report for fiscal 93 only covers up to the 30th of June 1993. Commodore went bankrupt in May 1994, so there's almost a whole year of missing data that we need to account for. There's no shareholder report for 1994. Commodore were defunct before the end of this fiscal year. But luckily, there are some surviving documents from this time. In one report, we can find exact unit sales for the final years of Commodore. Fiscal 92 sales, described as slightly over 1 million, were in fact 1.01 million. 93's report claimed sales of over 800,000, but the post-bankruptcy figure is only 785,000. We also see data for the first half of fiscal 94. 281,000 units total. This 6-month figure includes the most profitable part of the year, the run-up till Christmas. It's a drastic reduction from previous years, but Commodore were struggling to pay their suppliers. I imagine production had all but stopped by this point, and as the supply chain shut down, stock issues would have further hampered sales. We could presume that the final 2 quarters would have significant further decrease. Typically, the second half of the year accounts for 40% of sales, and Commodore went bankrupt 4 months into this period. An optimistic estimate would be 120,000 units for the remainder of the year, but I suspect it's lower. To get an idea of the scale of this decline, we can look at the sales of the CD32. 100,000 units were made, and it's likely all were sold. 75,000 sold in the first half of the year. Thus, we can assume sales of 25,000 for the remainder. A realistic estimate for the end of '94 would be a third of those from the first half of the year. This equates to approximately 90,000 units, giving us around 370,000 for the entire fiscal year. There's also the Amigas made and sold after Commodore's bankruptcy to consider. German PC company Escom purchased the remains of Commodore in 1995. They restarted production of the A1200 shortly after, and were able to get 50 to 60,000 machines ready by the end of the year. But by early 1996, Escom too were in financial difficulty. It's likely there was no further production. According to Petro Tichenko, director of Amiga Technologies, Escom sold 50,000 A1200s and 4,000 A4000Ts by the end of 1996. So 54,000 Amigas were sold during Escom's brief tenure. It's possible there was a trickle of further sales from residual stock, but I doubt that would amount to any significant increase. So, 4.49 million Amigas were sold up to the end of fiscal '93. 370,000 in fiscal '94, and 54,000 during the Escom reign. That gives us a grand total of 4.91 million. This is our answer, the total number of Amigas ever sold. Mystery solved. I can finally put these reports back on my shelf, where they can gather all the dust they desire. We can all sleep more soundly, now that we really know how many Amigas Commodore sold. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, farewell.